Hi everyone, sorry that I can't be in class today, but today you're going to be looking at what the conditions were actually like fighting in World War One, and also have a look at the Battle of the Somme, which really demonstrates those conditions. So at the start of the war, they expected that the war was going to move quickly, that there'd be massive movements of troops, and that actually didn't happen because the armies kept trying to outflank each other, which means you can see on this chart here one side, so they were divided into their two sides. The Entente formed the Allied powers, so that was Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, well, Italy actually joined the war later on the Allied side, but Germany and Austria-Hungary became the Central powers. So as they faced each other, they tried to outflank each other, which meant they tried to get up and around the other army. But then the other tried to do that, so then they'd have to move up further and further. And it formed between September and October 1914 what became a race to the sea. And as they outflanked each other, they dug in these trenches. So they ended up fighting in trenches on two opposing sides facing each other. So this formed into what's called a war of attrition. The trenches on each side opposed each other, and in between there was land that neither side had, so it became known as no man's land. To try to take that land, you'd actually need the soldiers to go up over the trenches into no man's land and try to basically overrun the enemy's trench. So send so many people over they could take over the enemy trench and force the enemy to retreat. The problem with that was that there was barbed wire, and also the enemy would fire machine guns from the trenches. So huge numbers of soldiers would run over, and just huge numbers would be gunned down, and it would just keep going and going until either the attacking side gave up, or the attacking side was able to send so many troops over they couldn't all be gunned down and take the enemy trench. So with something that was that painstaking, the war didn't move very much. The trenches were pretty dug in. And it became what's called a war of attrition. So that's attrition means basically giving up and walking away. So it's a war to see who can last longer or who's going to give up and go away. And as long as each side can stay in the game, neither can really win, because remember, it takes so much effort to try to take those trenches. The conditions in the trenches, at least early in the war, were terrible. So you can see this British trench here. It's flooded. There's nothing really holding up the walls of the trenches. They were unhygienic, so that could lead to trench foot, which was a foot infection, which often meant that legs had to be amputated. They were also infested with rats. They could flood, which you can see here. So Europe can be very rainy. And there was a constant fear of death, combined with it also being very boring. So if you think a lot of the time you're in your trench, trying to defend it, waiting to see if anyone attacks, that's actually going to get really boring just being there all the time. But there's also this constant fear of death and the stench of rotting flesh around you. The German trenches were actually a bit better built. So if you look here, they've got wooden scaffolding around it. The ground looks more clearly dug out. And the reason was that the Germans thought early on that the war was going to last a while. They thought they were going to be there for a while, so they might as well make themselves comfortable. I would bear that in mind for your test later. Whereas the British and the Allied forces thought that the war would be over quickly and they wouldn't actually be in the trenches for very long, so they didn't, at least initially, build trenches that were as good. So this brings us to the focus of today's lesson, which is the Battle of the Somme. Your learning goals are to understand the course of the Battle of the Somme, which is one of the battles that Australians actually fought in. And then maybe we might build on this when I get back to class in our next lesson. We'll discuss some of the historical views on Douglas Haig's leadership. Your success criteria today, you should really just be able to recount the conditions experienced, talk about the way things were for soldiers, the experiences they had, and also what enabled one side to ultimately win the battle. So the Battle of the Somme was quite a long battle. It lasted from the 1st of July to the 18th of November 1916. So that's August, September, October, November. That's over 4 months of fighting. And it was one of the deadliest battles of the war. It was an attempt by the Allies on the Western Front to try to gain ground from Germany. So all the Allied forces, France, the UK, the British, the rest of their empire, were trying to gain ground from Germany. And it was a very bloody battle. There was an extraordinarily high death toll, but very little territory was actually gained. It was also, as I said, one of the battles Australians fought in, and one thing you'll hear in the video is actually more Australians died at the Somme than died in Gallipoli. So you're going to watch a video recounting the Somme, and it will be paused at particular intervals, for you to write down your answers and also talk about them with the rest of your table. Good luck.